Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the recent tensions between the White House and the press corps and how it's raised questions about the state of journalism in America and the role of the free press in American democracy. We are lucky today to be joined by Margaret Talev to help us break this down and tell us why it matters. Margaret was the Kramer Director of the Syracuse University Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship, and she previously worked as a senior White House correspondent for Bloomberg News and was the president of the White House Correspondents Association. Margaret, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thanks. It's great to be back with you guys.
So just to remind everybody, some of today's questions come from our ASP community. So thank you everyone who contributed. Let's jump right in. So there's been some changes underway in the White House press briefing room, starting with the administration's February announcement that it's going to select which news outlets can regularly cover President Trump. Margaret, what are some of the ways that the press engages with the president and his officials at the White House daily? And is it common for the incoming president to change the past administration's media engagement policies?
Thanks for the question. And as you know, some of the current tension points are actually being litigated through the U.S. court system. So we'll keep watching those, obviously, quite closely as they evolve. But I would say this, the engagement that any of your members or the public would typically see are the televised press briefings where reporters are talking to the White House press secretary, or a formal news conference with the president, or what are called pool sprays that might be in the Oval Office or in a larger conference room. And that's, of course, when you can't fit the whole press corps and you need to have a more limited system of reporters who can then ask questions and share the information on behalf of their colleagues as well as for the public. I would just say this, there are also interactions before this administration that the public doesn't see because they're not public events, there's not cameras, but this might involve a president taking questions from reporters on Air Force One, or individual reporters or groups of reporters being invited to go to a briefing, maybe with a national security official or an economic official, right? And these sort of interactions, might be off the record, they might be on background, but they do traditionally help shape the coverage of events. You'd asked if this changes between presidents, and the answer is yes, of course. It depends on whether a president is sort of press forward or press friendly, or less comfortable with press interactions, whether his team thinks he's well served by those interactions, whether the U.S. is in the middle of a war, right? And also it's changed because of technology. So those press briefings with the press secretary, those used to be off camera until Bill Clinton's presidency. And then putting them on camera over time has changed the nature of them. They used to be real question and answer sessions, not so much about the soundbite, but more about trying to get information. They've become much more performative over time and much more used for spin, because if you're openly answering a question, you can have more of a gotcha moment, right? Over time, also, I'd say reporters' access inside those buildings, whether it's the White House or the State Department or the Pentagon, that access has shrunk over time. It is especially shrinking now in this moment. This moment is not like all those other moments and all that other sort of continuity of change, though. What's happening now is really different than what's happened under presidents in our lifetimes. There is a strategic effort underway to test the protections of the First Amendment as it applies to news organizations, to test the court's willingness or power to maintain the First Amendment protections. There's an effort to try to discredit actually quite neutral and reliable news outlets, to divide the public, to confuse the public, to chill free expression, to damage the for-profit business models of news organizations, to cut funding for public media, to punish news organizations for the substance and the style of what they're reporting, and to try to restrict large national outlets that have traditionally covered the White House from a 24/7 operation. And you will hear, we have all heard the messaging that this is really about expanding access to new media. But from my perspective, the legacy outlets are not trying to restrict access to new media, therefore expanded access. The concern is that this is actually about doing the opposite. It is about reducing the public's access to information because it is reducing the ability of those major and generally neutrally based outlets to ask those difficult questions and to be there on the ground to experience things in person. To me, I think this is a real concern, no matter what your politics are, whether you're a conservative or liberal or neutral in your ideology. Restricting the ability of news organizations to be treated credibly and to ask difficult questions is a problem, potentially a real problem for our freedoms.
Sure. In March, the White House announced it would take over responsibilities formerly handled by the White House Correspondents Association, like controlling the briefing room's seating chart. What is the White House Correspondents Association, and what role has the organization historically played in managing media affairs at the White House?
You just asked me, Chris, about a century of tradition and history, but I'll try to do it tightly. You might identify that group, the WHCA, with the dinners that have gotten a lot of attention because of the celebrities who attend. But the truth is that the overwhelming majority of what are hundreds of WHCA members at any given time, these are journalists that you probably don't recognize or know by name. Many of them are covering local outlets or niche outlets, or they're the people behind the scenes, reporters, producers, editors, camera operators, as well as the kind of anchors or hosts that you might recognize. The WHCA exists to help them do their jobs. It's actually much more mundane than the dinner appears. This is an organization that was founded in early 1914, and the historical reason for its formation is actually kind of interesting. The president at the time was President Wilson, and he was talking about threatening to do away with news conferences because he felt like they had gotten kind of out of hand, or that some of the reporters from the evening papers, just to date the state of media at the time, the evening newspapers, he was saying, had reporters that were printing his remarks that he had shared in an off-the-record capacity. So journalists were at risk of losing access to the president to ask the president questions. And so a group of them banded together to try to keep Wilson from ending the news conferences. And they wanted to maintain a structure that would keep the president accountable to the public through their questions, but also set up a system of accreditation for those news conferences so that it wasn't like a free-for-all. So that was the beginning of this system to organize and kind of make shared arguments on behalf of the regular White House press corps. And obviously, over time, the work of the association has expanded, but it's all along the same theme. It is work to preserve journalists' ability to cover whoever the president is at any given time, and to help keep the press corps organized and working for each other. I mean, we're all, competitors, but sort of friendly competitors. We're all trying to get at the same thing, which is what are the facts, what is the truth, and what are the questions that should be asked of the most powerful person in the world.
I'll say one of the years that I went, one of our first interns at ASP ended up getting a scholarship through the White House Correspondents Association. So we went and supported. She's gone to do amazing things, but the whole thing was really about these young journalists getting scholarships and being put forward. It's very, very cool. The White House has also announced plans to rotate traditional media outlets from the first row and expand access for emerging and digital media outlets. You touched a little bit about this before, but are there specific editorial standards required for journalists and outlets to participate in the White House briefing room and the press corps? And if so, who's responsible to enforce those?
I know it does seem confusing trying to figure out who's in charge and what are they basing their decisions on, right? I will tell you this. Historically, the White House has made the decisions about which media or journalists to allow into the White House complex. And the White House Correspondents Association has made decisions about who to credential into its own membership structure. But the Correspondents Association has not been the decision maker or been involved in who gets to attend what briefings or who the president might interview on a case-by-case basis. The Correspondents Association has traditionally organized that pooled coverage, though. And the reason for it is that the Correspondents Association represents correspondents. And there's limited room. If you could put 500 people on Air Force One and they could all afford to pay their own freight, they'd all get to go. But there's 13 seats, and it's got to accommodate print, wire service, digital outlets, network TV, and photographers. And 13 seats for, a couple thousand people who want to be there it has to be managed. Same with access inside the Oval Office. And, you might have heard this when you go to the White House. You guys have both been, I think. It's actually much smaller than it looks like it is on TV. And so the purpose of the pools is to do a fair job of distributing coverage to around the organizations whose mission is news focused. They're in the news gathering, not the opinion business, and who represent a diversity of outlets and who can share their reporting with the public and reach large numbers of the public and share it with other news organizations, right? So the White House makes the decisions about who to let into the White House and who to give access to for individual interviews with the president. But there is decades and decades of precedent for the pool structure as it currently exists. And some of the litigation that we sort of soft mentioned at the beginning of our conversation has to do with exclusionary efforts or efforts to punish in violation of the First Amendment. And so these are really complex issues. They seem simple, but the more you dig, the intent and the outcome and how that impacts the First Amendment and ultimately the public's right to information and journalists' right to free expression. Those are some of the more complex issues at play here.
The White House Correspondents Association released a statement saying the new policies tear at the independence of a free press in the United States. As one of the 5 freedoms guaranteed in the First Amendment, what role does press access play in our government, and how does that intersect with the other constitutional freedoms?
Yeah, so the 5 freedoms we're talking about, freedom of religion, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition, and of course, the freedom of the press. And that freedom of the press is essential because it allows the public the platform to share their views in those other areas, those other freedoms, and because it allows the sharing of facts and holding truth to power, even when that might make powerful people uncomfortable or angry. And it's just a cornerstone, right? I mean, freedom of the press is a cornerstone of human freedom and of countries that have strong democracies and rule of law. And outside the US, over the course of history, we have seen that when there is a rise to power of repressive leaders, their first move, or one of their first moves, is always to clamp down on the free press in order to silence critics and keep people in the dark about what's going on. So I think that's part of why there's so much concern in this area, because when you curb the press's ability to do its job and try to have a role in punishing people when you don't like what they say, those harken back to some of those bigger concerns.
Last month, the President Trump signed an executive order to cut taxpayer funding for Voice of America, which he accused of being anti-Trump and radical. At the same time, Elon Musk announced that Doge is looking into defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR. Can you explain a little bit about why public media exists and who decides what's fair or biased in its coverage?
Yeah, and I'll say as a side note that my late father, who fled Bulgaria in the 1960s, worked for the Voice of America for many decades, bringing news that Eastern Europeans could not get because of censorship in the Soviet Union and all of the satellite countries into those countries. So you ask about public media, and it can be a pretty broad definition. It can mean many things, but it's usually based around a few ideas. The idea that you're doing news whose mission is public service, and news whose funding is non-commercial. So this could be a lot of different things. It might mean taxpayer funding or some taxpayer component. It could mean licensing fees. It could mean underwriting, donations, philanthropic support. This could be local. It could be national. It could be international in scope.
A Gallup poll published in February found that Americans' trust in media to report news fairly and accurately has fallen to its lowest point in over 50 years. What factors have contributed to this, and how can media outlets restore the public's trust?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and it's a question that news organizations ask themselves all the time. Gallup's polling is fascinating. They have been tracking trust trends since around the year I was born, which is it's hard to believe that was that long ago, but it was like a half a century ago. And over time, you can see that not just trust in the media, but trust in just about every institution, from big business, corporations, to the military, the White House, the Supreme Court, education, labor unions, Congress, and the press has been declining in terms of public trust. So on the one hand, I think this is a societal challenge. It's not just about the press, but obviously it matters. The press reflects society. And if you don't feel that you can trust what you're reading or watching, why would you read it or watch it? There's an interesting point, which is that when people say they don't trust the media, they tend to mean they don't trust the media that they disagree with. They do very much trust the media that they trust, but they don't interpret the question that way. So the answer is a little bit complicated by human psychology, but undeniably there is a decline in trust in the media. And some of this is because the media itself has become so fractured and so siloed and really has different audiences, right? But another big piece of this seems to be correlated to the decline in local news. Because when you ask people what kind of news they trust, local news is the most trusted kind of news. It tends to be about real issues happening in your community, and the journalism is told by people you may know, or at least people that you know someone who knows them. And as the digital age had really decimated the local newspaper industry, it's been hard for local news to find its footing again. And we have seen that decline in trust and that increase in political polarization go hand in hand with the decline, the chartable decline of local news and the creation of news deserts all over this country. So there is a massive, I'm talking about $500 million or so campaign underway right now to experiment with injecting funding and creative new efforts into rebuilding local news. Part of the hope there is that it can rebuild trust in news overall in the process.
You mentioned before that people tend to trust media that they agree with and distrust ones that they don't. How do Americans distinguish the partisan sources from the nonpartisan news sources?
Partisan and nonpartisan is one area, and polarization is another area. This polarization and the fracturing of the media landscape, it has affected how Americans regard their news sources and their reliability in basically every way you can imagine. And I'll just say this. One thing that I really recommend, not only to my students, but to members of the public when I talk with them about how media works and how government works, is that you should develop your own media diet. You should be purposeful about where you are getting news every day about issues that you care about. And you should look for a mix of mainstream, neutral news organizations. And by that, I mean like network news, right? Like ABC, CBS, NBC, Nightly News, World News, or major newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, but also look for liberal and conservative outlets and mix them into your media diet. Look for some cultural or news adjacent coverage. Look for a mix of local and international as well as local news, because you want to be consuming a mix of media that not only reaffirms what you already believe, but challenges some of those beliefs. And because even if you're watching a newscast that you either may not agree with or may not really think is fact-based or don't think that all of their facts are on point, it's important to understand what news other people are consuming and what is shaping their beliefs. If you're only here reading and watching and listening to coverage that affirms your pre-existing views, then it means you don't know what tens of millions of other Americans or millions and millions of people around the world are hearing and reading and seeing and thinking about the same issues. And those silos are really, really dangerous. We don't all have to agree on everything. And I think in most cases, there is a general set of facts and then a lot of things that are outside of those facts. But it is important to know what other people are consuming and believe in order for us to be able to talk to each other and find compromise and a peaceful way forward.
That is a great point. Okay, Mark mentioned that members of the ASP community submitted questions for you before the conversation. One individual asked if the media's need to make a profit conflicts with its ability to be free and unbiased.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question for obvious reasons, right? I mean, for-profit news is a business. For businesses to be viable, they have to have customers or consumers. And of course, the concern is that you don't want those considerations to lead to any decisions that would downplay news that people should be getting, or over amp it, hype it for clicks, or completely silence views that are outside what your audience wants to hear, or mislead people about developments and what's going on. And because of the First Amendment, there's really not, this is not policeable. This is sort of, every news consumer has to weigh these considerations for themselves. But having said that, I have worked for a number of business news entities over my career that I think have been in the right place with that balance, where you want a product that is interesting enough for people who want to consume it, but where the basis of the reason that people keep coming back is because the product is trustworthy and the product considers a range of viewpoints, and the goal of the news product is to get to the truth, the best approximation of the truth as we can know based on verifiable facts. I don't think that's true of every news organization, but I think it is absolutely possible to get trustworthy, reliable news from for-profit entities. But I also think part of the reason you should have a diverse media diet is because you want a mix of private and public media. You want a mix of nonprofit media and for-profit media, and you want a mix of different point of views so that you can have a full accounting of the reporting that's out there, and kind of gut check yourself. Are my reflexive sources of news telling me enough of what's happening that I need to know, or do I need to adjust the way I consume news?
So you spoke a bit earlier about the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is next week. Traditionally, there's a comedian that headlines the dinner, and this year the association announced they canceled a planned appearance by Amber Ruffin, the comedian. So what does the cancellation of Amber's appearance say about the changing relationship between the press and the White House, and how is this going to impact the tone of this dinner and future dinners at the White House Correspondents'?
I'm going to defer to the current board of the Correspondents Association to talk about any specifics around this year's dinner. But in general, I'll say this. I see journalists and editorial cartoonists and comedians all as sort of cousins in the same First Amendment family. What the role they have in common is to shine a light to power and to hold power accountable. And we have somewhat different missions, but also a lot of overlapping goals that can help Americans or the public at large kind of consider complex ideas, or see a broad truth amid all of the details, kind of connect the dots or challenge your assumptions, right? And all of us in these different categories are deeply protected in the United States by the First Amendment to share information, whether it's satirical information or whether it is fact-based information. And you ask about the changing relationship between the press and the White House, but I have been thinking these days a lot about the relationship between the press and the public and our society at large. And I think because we've become so fractured, as we've been talking about, and polarized in terms of whatever you take in, news, entertainment, any kind of media, that really impacts your ability to message to any one audience at any one given time, right? And the focus of the dinner, the annual dinner, is to raise money and awareness for scholarships for the next generation of student journalists, and to elevate and award what a panel of judges have decided are some of the most impactful reporting from the previous year by journalists who cover the White House and the presidency. And so I think the challenge over time has been how to do that in a way that can reach across those fractured audiences and show everyone the importance of fact-based news for them. And that the reporter's mission is to deliver facts that can be verified and a range of viewpoints to you, no matter what your politics are, no matter what your ideological views are. And that's what the focus of the dinner should be about and has to be about.
Margaret, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. I really appreciate your insight and your time.
Thank you so much. We're big fans.
Thank you. Me too. Thanks so much, and hope to see you guys in Washington.